The emergency room of Crestview Elite Medical Center was a portrait of controlled chaos. Doctors weaved through crowded hallways, nurses scribbled hurried notes onto patient charts, and the constant beeping of heart monitors filled the air. Yet, despite the rush, one fact was crystal clear. Only those with status and wealth received immediate attention. In the waiting area, a frail elderly woman in a hospital gown sat slumped in her wheelchair, ignored while a wealthy socialite, draped in expensive jewelry, was promptly escorted into a private suite. A young mother cradled her feverish child, pleading with the receptionist for a doctor, but the only response she received was a bored look and a pointed finger toward a clipboard of paperwork. Then, the glass doors slid open, and in walked David Carter. A tall, well-dressed black man in his late 40s, David moved with the grace of a man accustomed to power. But at this moment, power meant nothing. His chest burned like fire, and every breath felt like a battle. His expensive charcoal suit was damp with sweat. His hand clutched at his heart as his knees buckled slightly. Linda, his assistant, nearly screamed as she rushed to his side. "Mr. Carter, hold on! Just breathe!" She turned toward the front desk, waving frantically. "Please, my boss is in serious pain. He needs a doctor now." The receptionist, a young woman in crisp blue scrubs, barely glanced up from her computer screen. She sighed, pushing a clipboard toward Linda. "Fill out the forms and take a seat." Linda's face twisted in disbelief. "He's having a heart attack. He could die." Several nearby patients turned their heads, sensing the tension. Some whispered, others looked away, pretending not to notice. At that moment, the double doors to the examination room swung open, and in walked Dr. William Sterling. Tall, sharp-featured, and radiating the arrogance of a man who had never been questioned, Dr. Sterling surveyed the room like a king inspecting his court. His white coat was pristine, his expression indifferent. "What's the commotion?" he asked, voice clipped. The receptionist barely looked up. "This man needs urgent care," she said, gesturing lazily toward David. Dr. Sterling's gaze flicked toward David, scanning him up and down. His smirk deepened. "We're at capacity. He can go to a public hospital." The words hit like a slap. Gasps rippled through the room. Linda's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious. This is a private hospital. He has insurance." Dr. Sterling barely acknowledged her. He crossed his arms, his voice laced with thinly veiled disdain. "I don't care. My time is too valuable to waste on people like him." Silence. A nurse in the corner flinched. A security guard at the entrance shifted uncomfortably. Linda's hands clenched into fists. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Dr. Sterling chuckled. "Oh, really? And why is that?" David, despite the agony clawing at his chest, slowly reached into his pocket. His hands trembled slightly, but his movements were controlled. He pulled out his sleek black card, the kind that very few people in the world possessed. He held it out, his breathing labored. "Check my credentials, doctor." Dr. Sterling scoffed but didn't take the card. He waved a dismissive hand. "I don't need to see any credentials. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." The room seemed to shrink. A nearby nurse sucked in a breath. The elderly woman in the wheelchair gripped the arms of her seat, watching intently. David's vision blurred slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I am David Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Industries, a major donor to this hospital." Dr. Sterling's smirk finally faltered. Linda stepped closer, her voice sharp as a blade. "He doesn't just have insurance, doctor. Sterling, he funds this hospital. You work for him." The blood drained from Dr. Sterling's face. David exhaled slowly, the weight of his condition pressing down harder. "Now, tell me again, doctor. Who belongs here?" The tension in the room was suffocating. A single nurse, eyes wide with realization, whispered, "Oh my God." Dr. Sterling swallowed, his jaw tightening. But before he could say another word, another voice cut through the air. Get him to a trauma room, now! The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Elaine Matthews, rushed forward, her face a mixture of concern and fury. What in the hell is going on here? Linda turned to her, shaking with anger. Your star doctor just refused to treat the man who pays his salary. Dr. Matthews's eyes darted to David, then to the black card in his hand, then back to Dr. Sterling, who now looked as if he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Her face turned cold. Dr. Sterling, consider yourself suspended. The waiting room erupted in whispers. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dr. Matthews didn't wait for a response. She turned to the nearest nurse. Get Mr. Carter into Trauma 1 immediately, and someone call the board of directors. David let out a ragged breath as two nurses hurried to his side, guiding him toward the double doors. As he was wheeled past Dr. Sterling, he mustered just enough strength to say, Next time, think before you judge. Dr. Sterling stood frozen, his reputation and his career collapsing in front of him. As the doors swung shut behind David, Linda cast one last glare at the disgraced doctor. You thought power meant deciding who gets treated, but real power? She leaned in, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. Real power means knowing that everyone deserves care. And with that, she turned on her heel, following David into the trauma room, leaving Dr. Sterling drowning in his own humiliation. David groaned, his hand pressing harder against his chest, his legs trembling as he struggled to stay on his feet. A bead of sweat dripped down his temple, his breathing shallow. The world around him blurred slightly, the pain in his chest tightening like an iron fist. A young nurse standing behind the receptionist shifted uncomfortably, her brow furrowed with concern. She hesitated before leaning toward the receptionist. Maybe we should at least run some tests. Dr. Sterling's head snapped in her direction, his cold blue eyes narrowing dangerously. Do not question my judgment, he hissed. There are more important patients waiting. The young nurse flinched, swallowing hard. She quickly stepped back, looking down at her clipboard, but her hands trembled slightly. A few other doctors in the vicinity exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen Dr. Sterling's arrogance before. They had watched him treat certain patients with the utmost care, while others, particularly those who didn't fit his narrow view of priority, were pushed aside. But he was powerful in this hospital. No one dared to challenge him. David gritted his teeth, still struggling to stay upright. He wasn't just fighting against the pain now. He was fighting against something far more insidious, prejudice wrapped in a white coat. Dr. Sterling, David said, his voice slow but firm. Are you refusing to treat me? Dr. Sterling smirked, folding his arms. Call it selective care. Linda snapped. Her hands were shaking with rage as she reached for her phone. I'm calling hospital administration. Dr. Sterling let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head. Go ahead. You think they'll listen to you? He spread his arms, turning toward the watching staff and patients. I've worked here for 20 years. I've saved the lives of senators, business moguls, and foreign dignitaries. I am this hospital. You think some assistant's complaint is going to change that? A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke. David exhaled slowly, his vision swimming. His patience was razor thin. He knew men like Sterling, men who thought power made them untouchable. But before Linda could press a single button on her phone, the double doors to the emergency ward swung open. A team of senior hospital administrators stormed in, their expressions dark with fury. At the center of them was a stern-looking woman in a fitted navy blue suit, clutching a thick file. Dr. Sterling's smirk disappeared instantly. Dr. Sterling, the woman said in a cold, clipped tone, step away from the patient. Now. The entire waiting room went silent. David forced himself to remain upright, watching the scene unfold. Dr. Sterling straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his arrogance. "Dr. Matthews?" he said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Dr. Elaine Matthews, the chief medical officer, did not smile. She didn't even blink. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "You owe the pleasure," she said icily, "to your negligence, your arrogance, and your complete disregard for the hospital's code of ethics." She held up the thick file. "This," she continued, "is a full report on your behavior over the last 5 years. Dozens of complaints, patients ignored, discriminatory practices, and yet somehow you've remained untouched." Dr. Sterling scoffed. "That's because I'm one of the best surgeons this hospital has." Dr. Matthews's eyes blazed. "Best surgeons?" She flipped open the file. 2 lawsuits filed for malpractice in the last 3 years, 5 patient complaints swept under the rug, and now, refusing to treat a man suffering from a potential heart attack simply because you decided he wasn't worth your time? Linda folded her arms. "Sounds like a pattern." Dr. Sterling's face reddened. He turned to his fellow doctors, looking for support, but none of them spoke. Not this time. Dr. Matthews exhaled sharply and turned to David. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of Crestview Elite Medical, I deeply apologize for this disgraceful treatment. You will be taken to an emergency suite immediately, free of charge, and receive the care you deserve." Dr. Sterling stepped forward, furious. "You can't do this. You can't just walk in here and—" Dr. Matthews turned back to him, eyes flashing with authority. "Actually, I can, because I'm your superior, and as of this moment, Doctor. Sterling, you are suspended pending a full review of your medical license." Gasps filled the room. Dr. Sterling froze. "Suspended?" His voice cracked. Security officers appeared at his side. Dr. Matthews's voice was steady and unshakable. "Pack your things. You're no longer welcome here." The room was deathly silent. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth, then shut it again. He turned, looking toward the reception desk, the doctors, the patients, but there was no sympathy for him, only disgust. As security escorted him toward the exit, a murmur spread through the crowd. A voice, an elderly man waiting in the corner, spoke up. "Finally," he muttered, "he's getting what he deserves." Another patient, a woman in her 60s, nodded. About time someone stood up to that man. As the hospital staff regained movement, the energy in the room shifted. Dr. Matthews turned back to David. "Let's get you seen immediately." David, still holding on to Linda for support, exhaled, his strength fading as the nurses rushed forward to wheel him into the trauma unit. Linda turned and cast one last glance toward the glass doors where Dr. Sterling was disappearing into the night, his once unshakable confidence shattered. Karma had arrived, and it had come with consequences. The room was thick with tension, the air almost too heavy to breathe. Every eye in the waiting area locked onto the unfolding confrontation between Ms. Reynolds, the head of hospital administration, and Dr. Sterling, the once smug doctor whose arrogance had just reached its breaking point. Ms. Reynolds's voice was crisp, each syllable laced with authority. "Dr. Sterling, we have a very serious problem." Dr. Sterling, still oblivious to the storm about to hit him, chuckled lightly, arms crossed. "Oh? And what would that be?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, as if the entire ordeal was beneath him. Without breaking eye contact, Ms. Reynolds handed him a thick file, her expression unreadable. "Read it." Annoyed, Dr. Sterling sighed and flipped through the pages. His brows furrowed at first, scanning the neatly typed words with mild impatience. But then, his fingers stiffened, his eyes widened, the color drained from his face as if someone had just sucked the life out of him. His hands started to tremble. The room, once filled with hushed murmurs and concerned whispers, now fell deathly silent. The entire waiting area, including the staff, the nurses, and even the other doctors, watched the scene unfold with bated breath. David, still gripping his chest, struggling to stay conscious, watched the doctor's reaction with quiet satisfaction. He already knew what was in that file, because it was his name on the hospital's ownership papers. Dr. Sterling's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He turned a few more pages, each one confirming what he desperately hoped was a mistake. His breathing became erratic. This, he stammered, his once powerful voice now a pathetic whisper. This isn't possible. Ms. Reynolds tilted her head slightly, her arms now crossed over her chest. Oh, it is. Her eyes flickered toward David before she delivered the final blow. And you just refused treatment to the man who signs your paycheck. A collective gasp spread through the waiting area. The nurses stiffened. The other doctors exchanged shocked glances. Patients who had once been helpless spectators were now grinning, enjoying the downfall of a man who had humiliated so many before. Dr. Sterling took a shaky step back, his world crumbling around him. No, this must be a mistake. His voice cracked as desperation crept in. David Carter is just some... He cut himself off, but it was too late. The weight of his words hung in the air like poison. David, despite the pain racking his body, let out a slow, humorless chuckle. Just somewhat, Dr. Sterling? His voice, though weak, carried across the room like a blade slicing through arrogance. Dr. Sterling looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Ms. Reynolds didn't let up. She flipped a page in the file and read aloud. David Carter, majority shareholder of Crestview Elite Medical, owner of one of the largest private healthcare investment firms in the country, a man who donates millions each year to ensure hospitals like this maintain their top-tier standards. She shut the file with a loud snap and glared at Dr. Sterling. And yet, you decided he wasn't worth your time. A nurse let out a low whistle. Another patient laughed under his breath. The entire room was now reveling in the poetic justice unfolding before them. Dr. Sterling's face twisted with panic. He turned toward David, his arrogance completely shattered. Mr. Carter, I didn't know... David's gaze was unwavering. No, you didn't, he said, voice steady despite the pain. And you didn't care to know. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, but before he could utter another word, Ms. Reynolds turned to the security officer standing by the doors. Escort Dr. Sterling to my office. Immediately. Two large security guards stepped forward, their expressions grim. One grabbed Dr. Sterling by the arm. Wait! Dr. Sterling shouted, yanking his arm back. Please, Ms. Reynolds, this is a misunderstanding. Ms. Reynolds raised a single brow. A misunderstanding? Her voice was pure steel. You refused treatment to a man in critical condition, a man who, may I remind you, owns the very hospital you work for. Dr. Sterling's lips parted, but he had nothing left to say. The guards tightened their grip. You're suspended indefinitely pending review, Ms. Reynolds continued, her tone unwavering. As of now, your medical license will be investigated by the state board. Dr. Sterling paled. No, please. I've worked here for 20 years. David exhaled deeply, finally sitting back in the wheelchair that Linda had pushed toward him. He wiped the sweat from his brow and locked eyes with the trembling doctor. And in 20 years you've destroyed how many lives? His voice was quiet, but cut through the silence like a knife. How many people have you judged unworthy of care? His stare hardened. Maybe it's time you know what it feels like to be dismissed. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. The guards started leading him toward the exit. Linda, arms crossed, watched with satisfaction. Funny, she mused. Didn't you say you were untouchable? Dr. Sterling let out a strangled noise, but the guards didn't slow down. His era of power was officially over. As the hospital doors swung open, the last thing anyone heard from him was his panicked, desperate voice. Please, I can fix this. But no one listened, because at that moment, Dr. Sterling no longer mattered. The room is thick with tension, the weight of Dr. Sterling's downfall pressing against every pair of watching eyes. A ripple of murmurs spreads through the hospital lobby like wildfire. Wait. He owns the hospital? This doctor is done for. Dr. Sterling stumbles backward, his once unshakable confidence crumbling like a sandcastle against a rising tide. His face is ashen, his hands trembling as the realization sinks in. He just sealed his own fate. David, still gripping his chest, finally speaks. His voice is calm, but carries the weight of power, control, and long overdue justice. Tell me, Doctor. Sterling, am I still not worthy of your time? Sterling swallows hard, his lips parting, but no coherent words come out. He fumbles, desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. I didn't know, he stammers. David's eyes, sharp despite the pain, lock onto him. That shouldn't matter. His voice, though weakened by his condition, holds undeniable authority. A doctor's job is to save lives, not judge who deserves care. The weight of his words settles over the room like a gavel striking a verdict. A wave of disgust washes over the hospital staff. Nurses exchange looks of silent fury. A few patients shake their heads. Even the receptionist who had dismissed David now looks at the floor in shame. Ms. Reynolds, the head of hospital administration, steps forward, her gaze steely. Dr. Sterling, she announces, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further review. Gasps echo through the waiting area. Sterling jolts, his body stiffening in sheer panic. Wait, you can't! His voice is shrill, desperate. David smirks, despite the pain gripping his chest. Oh, she can. And she will. Two security guards step forward, their expressions unreadable, but their intent clear. You need to leave now, sir. Sterling's head whips around, his eyes darting frantically between the staff, the nurses, the patients, anyone who might speak in his defense. But no one does. The same people who once cowered under his arrogance now watch as he is led away in disgrace. The weight of his humiliation is suffocating, crushing every ounce of the superiority he once wielded. The doors swing open, cameras flash, whispers turn into full-blown conversations. Karma at its finest. He got exactly what he deserved. This is the day the hospital changes. As Sterling disappears into the night, David exhales deeply, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. The young nurse who had tried to help earlier rushes to his side, her voice soft but urgent. We need to get him to surgery, now. David, despite his labored breathing, offers her a weak smile. That's all I ever wanted. The hospital staff, no longer shackled by fear, move into action, not for profit, not for status, but for what truly matters. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, everyone mattered.